Hi everyone. In the second part of this week's lecture, we're going to briefly reflect on the connections between modern food production, the environment, and justice for humans. So in the previous video, we were interrogating some dominant ideas about the position of animals within society and their relationship to humans. And this lecture is just adding to that by briefly highlighting some of the implications of our current food production systems. Social ecology is an approach that can help us to think through the connections between humans and the environment and social justice for humans and environmental issues, and I think it's really important to include when we discuss this particular topic. As we look at the impact of industrial food production on animals and other aspects of the environment, both living and non-human living, we can of course see that the exploitation and oppression of human beings is very much bound up with the exploitation and oppression of animals as well. And if we think back to other things we've learned in the course so far, some of the ways in which the processes of industrialization, which was bound up and really entangled with processes of colonization, how they've developed and still maintain inequality between people in the world, as some nations, social groups, and individuals accumulate vast quantities, and indeed corporations accumulate vast quantities of wealth over time. A widening gap of inequalities has really paved the way for particular advanced and subtle modern forms of slavery and human exploitation. And all of those processes are ultimately at the core of what has also damaged the environment, and by constructing society along hierarchical lines too, that we're exploring now. So this is the central argument of social ecologists, that the way we structure our society hierarchically and those unequal relationships between humans and the way we subordinate people is part of a broader paradigm that also subordinates nature, including humans, non-human animals, and other aspects of the natural environment. So it's based on the conviction that nearly all our present ecological problems originate in deep-seated social problems. And ecological problems can't be really understood, let alone solved, without a careful understanding of our existing society and the arguable irrationalities that dominate at the moment. When we look at modern food production processes, scholars have pointed out that a number of incredibly deep irrationalities have structured the systems in ways that have negatively impacted not just animals, but negatively impact human beings and the broader environment as well. So this has been a massive shift that was really kickstarted by the Industrial Revolution, which, as you know, spread through processes of colonization and imperial conquest, where small communities based in subsistence, farming and small-scale economies and ecologies were replaced by large-scale monocultures. Along with this large-scale monoculture came a strong reliance on one type of crop for the full yield, creating a real need for pesticides. And in a naturally diverse environment, the need for heavy pesticides and chemicals is reduced, and you have this balance that's already there. So even chemically, some plants put nitrogen into the soil, others take it out, and they create this system that just really works. It's originally created, to have good fruit, to have good production without the need for additional things like fertilizers and other chemicals. Also in this system, if one crop fails for whatever reason, you've got others. But in the context of monocultures, you are reliant on those chemicals like fertilization and pesticides in order to maintain this kind of quite unnatural version of an ecology. And we also have intensive farming with tremendous amounts of land cleared for grazing livestock. Some of the figures around this are just astronomical. More land across the world is used for livestock than for any other kind of non-animal food production. livestock dominates modern industry, agriculture really. And a lot of the plants that are grown are actually grown to feed livestock, and this is particularly ineffective regarding the use of our resources. And livestock also destroys the soil culture. So even after growing plants and regenerating the local ecosystem is incredibly challenging. So not only does the extensive use of livestock impact the environment in a number of ways, such as carbon emission from the animals like cows, deforestation for grazing, and the erosion from overgrazing land, but also the energy is really inefficient for cleaning large areas of land to produce these monocultural farms like for corn or for grain to feed the animals as the land over time becomes really barren. It is really simply put a very ineffective system in terms of waste and energy use. And we have talked about this in past weeks, the issues of resource and energy waste for the purpose of growth and profit that is not inherently needed, particularly when more sustainable or conservation-based practices are available. But part of modern agriculture today also involves increasing corporate or private sector ownership, which is problematic for many reasons. For example, about 70% of chickens slaughtered each year in Australia are under 2 corporations. So this creates a vast accumulation of corporation power and a reduction in small and medium-sized family-operated or community-operated food production. So increasingly in our world, we are reliant on corporate food production in these mechanized systems, so leaving very little of what has been called food sovereignty in academia. And we see this with the cost of living crisis as well, and floods and other natural disasters often intensified by climate change, that the prices of food skyrocket and people don't really have much of a choice but to pay because there are no other sources of food because of the reduction in small-scale farming practices. In addition to this dependency on higher mechanized systems for our food security, there is a number of negative impacts of industrial agriculture. Most notably, perhaps, is the depletion of land, forests, and ecosystems. So monocultural strips of soil, as we've talked about, they inhibit the natural process of keeping soil healthy and fertilize, which is why fertilization or fertilized products are used, and the only reason fertilizers have been developed kind of to a larger scale. Extensive irrigation of crops that might not be suitable for the land as well. Often it's not drought resistant. It causes erosion of the soil as well. Here in Australia, we are very dry, and yet we farm a lot of cotton and a lot of other materials that require lots of water use. It doesn't really make sense when we could engage in other methods. Water pollution, as we know as well, is the contamination of water with waste, and in this case it's often with pesticides and fertilizers, will enter waterways and impact the local environment. So when we have broader loss of biodiversity, the breakdown of ecosystems and the loss of animal habitat and life, all kind of happening around agricultural systems. And I have also mentioned, even if it is not lost, the local ecosystem and animal life may not be able to live well even if they do survive near agricultural systems. We really need to start to think about modern food production processes as part of this whole system as well. So when we buy our food or any product, really, we need to start to make it a more automatic thought, to think about the decision we're going to make within the greater system of production versus conservation. So it's not just where the food is grown, but all the different things that go into the process of getting that product on the shelf. So the energy use, the chemicals, other harmful substances like wax or plastics as well that might have been involved. And agriculture, soil loss, greenhouse gases from livestock, polluted runoff and energy use due to the monocultural farming can kind of all be included in this decision as well, and this wider understanding of the process of what we're purchasing. And it does require more energy for it to be transported, and that's the idea of that there's no smaller scale farms anymore that we can go to for our food. We're kind of relying on these big corporations, and they do require more energy for it to be transported. Often they're international, they've been imported, and a big part of what we should be looking at in our food labels is reducing carbon emissions as much as possible by buying more local food, because again, processing, packaging, and the food waste also contributes to these inefficiencies in the whole system. So retail outlets, as we've kind of said, use more energy in transportation, which involves multiple steps. So getting the food to the place where it's produced, from the place where it's produced and packaged, then to the retailer, then to the shop, and eventually to the consumer. And all these steps make it a very energy inefficient process. So consumption practices also come with their own level of waste as well that we just need to start to become more aware about. But I suppose to come back to the topic and use these examples to talk about social justice, we can ask, what are the implications of all of this for social justice, for humans specifically? If we conceptualize social justice as primarily concerned with humans, there's many things within this that are problematic, like the use of pesticides and herbicides, which has significant impact on human health. There's a lot of research on the amount of pesticides and herbicides that we actually ingest from food consumption annually. And even workers who are directly involved in food production, particularly in poorer nations, experience a really high rate of herbicide and pesticide poisoning every year. There are also have been many cases of chemicals being injected into animals to make them bigger or less vulnerable to diseases. And these chemicals are, of course, then consumed by humans when we eat those animals. Make sure to do your research where the meat is actually from and how the meat is processed. If you are shopping at those larger stores like Coles and Woolies, you might be surprised of what chemicals is actually put into the animals being sold. And the waste from animal agriculture also has an impact, such as the case of the Tasmanian Atlantic salmon farms, where waste from the concentration of salmon kills the seabed below those farms, which of course is inevitably going to impact the local humans that are there, and then wider concerns for the environment. More broadly, again, agriculture is treated as a commodity in a capitalistic society. So it's a system that is geared towards exploitation of workers in developing countries and impacts individual farmers who are eventually pushed out by larger corporations. And the rights of farmers have been eroded as well through the concentration of corporate power in the food industry. So the availability of healthy foods for low-income people is also a real issue, where monocultures have created food dependency and communities face food insecurity despite having the land to grow their own foods. So to think about modern food production as not just including humans, animals, and the environment is really important. It's this social ecology sees these processes as deeply intertwined as well. So it's not just them independently, and kind of having this growing recognition as well in scholarship that shows that to address the social injustice for humans, we need to fundamentally question how we interact with the natural world and with animals and all these other aspects within the system as well. One last point before we finish, we can see some of these issues as well play out in the context of Australia during COVID-19, when seasonal workers were unavailable due to the travel restrictions. And our reliance on poorly paid, often exploited labour for food security became really clear, as there was huge amounts of food waste because farms couldn't find the labourers to pick up that food, particularly like fruit farms. So agricultural work is precarious for many workers because it's seasonal. The nature of mass agriculture and the imperative for profit leads to temporary migrant labourers who are more vulnerable to exploitation, and they often work in isolation away from their families and are highly dependent on the farms for their livelihood. Some alternative options have been presented from scholars and activists who have pointed out that we really need to dismantle this highly centralized, corporationalized system and create more plural, independent sources of food production to ensure food security. So one concept is food sovereignty, which challenges modern industrial agriculture and tries to disconnect communities from their dependence on large corporations for both food and employment as well. So creating small-scale community-based gardens, shared agricultural spaces and co-ops are some of the ways we're thinking forward, at least in academia. All right, everyone, plenty of food for thought. It will be good to discuss this more in class, and I will see you then.